A woman hangs laundry on her balcony, 9 stories up. A Boeing 747 passes so close she feels the heat from the engines on her face. The glasses in her kitchen cabinet rattle. She doesn't flinch. This happens 40 times a day. This was life under the flight path of Kai-Tak, the most dangerous commercial airport ever built. A place where pilots were trained to ignore every warning their cockpits screamed at them, where the approach was so terrifying that airlines refused to let crews attempt it without simulator practice first, and where an entire city learned to live in the shadow of machines that could kill them all. To understand how any of this was allowed to exist, you have to go back to a failed real estate deal in 1925. Two businessmen, Sir Kai and Mr. Tak, tried to build a luxury housing estate on a strip of reclaimed land jutting into Victoria Harbor. The project collapsed. They went bankrupt. The government seized the land, merged their names, and turned it into a grass airstrip for a local flying club. Nobody imagined it would become anything more. Then World War II arrived. Japanese forces occupied Hong Kong and needed a military airfield. They forced prisoners of war to lay concrete runways, demolishing ancient villages and tearing apart the walls of Kowloon-walled city for stone. When the British returned after the war, Hong Kong began expanding at a pace nobody anticipated. Refugees flooded in, factories multiplied, skyscrapers rose on every side of the airfield. The airport didn't grow toward the city swallowed the airport whole. By the time the jet age arrived, Kai-Tak was already a relic, a 1920s grass strip trying to survive inside a 1990s megacity. The geography was the real problem. Kai-Tak sat on reclaimed land, surrounded by water on 3 sides. To the north stood Lion Rock, a 1,600-foot wall of granite that made any straight-in approach physically impossible. So engineers designed something that had never been attempted anywhere else in commercial aviation. They built an instrument guidance system for Runway 13 that was deliberately offset by 47 degrees. Instead of guiding pilots to the runway, it guided them toward a giant checkerboard painted on the side of a hill. At around 650 feet, pilots had to find the checkerboard visually, disconnect the autopilot, and throw the aircraft into a steep descending right turn, all while flying over one of the most densely populated neighborhoods on Earth. After the turn, the instruments were useless. The last stretch was flown entirely by hand. No guidance, no safety net, just a pilot, a runway, and a wall of apartment buildings on either side. One retired captain described the first time he flew the approach. He said his hands were shaking so badly after landing that he couldn't unclip his harness for a full minute. After 5 years on the route, he said it never once became routine. Because of the bank angle during the turn, passengers sitting on the right side of the aircraft looked straight down into apartment windows and laundry lines. On the ground, the experience was equally surreal. Residents of Kowloon City could see faces through the cabin windows above them. The noise exceeded 100 decibels, louder than a chainsaw held at arm's length. Schools paused lessons every time a jet passed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Television volumes went to maximum. Some residents claimed they could identify aircraft types by sound alone. The sharp whine of a Trident, the deep growl of a 747. The sound of jet engines wasn't an interruption. It was the rhythm of daily life. And then there was the weather. Hong Kong sits in the path of typhoons. Wind would slam into Lion Rock and curl downward, creating violent wind shear on short final, exactly when pilots needed stability the most. They fought back with a technique called crabbing, flying the aircraft sideways, nose pointed directly at the apartment buildings, while the fuselage tracked toward the runway. From the ground, it looked like the plane was about to crash into someone's living room. The proximity alarms in the cockpit, designed to scream "pull up" when terrain gets dangerously close, went off on virtually every approach. Pilots were trained to ignore them every single time. The runway was dangerously short. Touchdown even slightly too far along it, and 400 tons of aircraft wouldn't stop before the concrete ended. In November 1993, that margin ran out. China Airlines Flight 605, a fully loaded 747, came in during a typhoon. The aircraft floated past its touchdown point, eating up precious runway with every second. The captain realized too late that the plane wouldn't stop. He yanked the aircraft left to avoid the approach lights and slid off the runway into Victoria Harbor. Miraculously, no one died. But here's the detail that tells you everything about Kai Tak. Flights resumed that same afternoon. Planes took off directly over the wreckage, sitting in the water. There was no alternative. There was only one runway. The city couldn't stop. At night, the approach became something else entirely. Lion Rock disappeared into blackness. The harbor vanished. The entire city became a flat, undifferentiated carpet of light. No visible line between land, water, and sky. Pilots had nothing to orient themselves except a chain of high-intensity strobe lights bolted to rooftops across the city. The strobes fired in rapid sequence, creating the illusion of a glowing ball racing toward the runway. You chased the light and hoped the runway was where it was supposed to be. Foreign carriers showed special briefing films to pilots before their first Hong Kong assignment. Some airlines required captains to complete the approach in a full-motion simulator before they were allowed to attempt it with passengers on board. Kai Tak wasn't just difficult, it was the final exam of commercial aviation. By the mid-1990s, this single runway was handling over 450 flights a day. Third busiest international passenger airport in the world. A takeoff or landing every 2 to 3 minutes. The system was running at the edge of what physics allowed. A new airport wasn't just needed, it was overdue by a decade. On July 5, 1998, at 11 p.m., they began the largest logistics operation in aviation history. 1,200 vehicles, 6 hours, 30 kilometers across the city. Ground equipment, baggage handlers, customs officers, air traffic controllers. Everything had to arrive in exact sequence. There would be no overlap, no transition period. The last flight would leave Kai Tak, and 6 hours later, the first flight would land at the new airport. One clean cut. At 2:30 a.m., the main computer system at the new airport crashed. Baggage belts froze. Flight information screens went dark. The cargo system collapsed entirely. Flights were due to arrive in 3 hours. Engineers bypassed servers and hot patch systems under emergency conditions. No sleep, no margin for error. Somehow, they pulled it off. At 10:05 a.m., the last flight departed Kai Tak. At 6:27 a.m. the next morning, the first commercial aircraft touched down at Chek. The old terminal sat empty for years. The Checkerboard stayed on the hillside, fading slowly under sun and rain, visible from across the harbor, like a scar that wouldn't quite heal. Plane spotters who had spent decades documenting the approach described an unexpected grief. One man said he drove to Kai Tak every weekend for 30 years. He was there for the very last flight. He watched it lift off, bank over the harbor, and disappear. Then he sat in his car and cried. Today, Kai Tak is a public park and cruise terminal. The Checkerboard is still there, faded, overgrown, visible only if you know where to look. Cheklapkok, the new airport, is an engineering marvel. They flattened an island and reclaimed 3,000 acres from the sea to build it. But forcing nature into submission always comes with a price. The artificial island is slowly sinking, compressing into the soft mud of the ocean floor. In some areas, the ground has dropped several inches since opening day. Engineers constantly monitor the runways for cracks. Kai-Tak was dangerous because of the mountains. Cheklapkok is fighting the ocean. When you look at the history of aviation in this city, it has always been the same story. Concrete forced into places it was never meant to exist. They wedged a runway between skyscrapers. Then they built an island where there was only sea. The old airport is gone. The new one is slowly settling into the water. And somewhere on a hillside in Kowloon, a faded checkerboard watches over an empty runway. The last trace of the most terrifying approach in aviation history.